the, it's still February, right? Yeah. February meetup of 2020 of KW Intersections. We will be having 2 talks today, and Anzo Bashkas will be starting with the first talk, where he will be talking about high performance measurements in React with MobX. And Anzo, he is a front-end architect at Maptin, and it's kind of a good start.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Mary. It's great to be here. Like you said, I'm a software architect at Maptin, and today we're going to be talking about MobX a little bit, but I don't want to make that the focus of this talk. We're not going to go that in depth in it. We're kind of going to get started with, kind of the evolution of React in the front end using React hooks, and why I think it was actually a great leap for React. And we're going to build an application almost from scratch. I was pretty ambitious at first, and I was like, I'm just going to go in and start downloading yarn packages and all this stuff. And I realized that that's really going to anger the demo guys. So I have the project ready with all its dependencies, and a couple styles, but everything else is pretty much from scratch. Just before we get started, how many of your front-end developers, or like do front-end? Cool. And how many use React? Okay. And how many use MobX? 1. Good, good. That's great. And how many use Redux? Cool. Awesome. So I tried to time this to fit in my time slot. I like to keep kind of an open forum, and you guys can ask questions. There's going to be dirty code, and for 2 reasons. One is this is a talk, so we don't need to optimize everything, and also it's kind of intentional, because later on when we start to refactor it, it's gonna make it easier to kind of follow along. And yeah, I guess we can get started. I'll show you what the app looks like that we're going to build, and then so we get an idea of what it looks like, and then we'll dive in. So the app is kind of a basic Netflix clone, you could say. It uses an API to download movies. In this case, these are action movies. You can keep fetching more and more movies, and then you can add things to the queue down here, and then you can like, which adds these stars at the bottom, or dislike. So kind of basic, but enough to demonstrate what I'm trying to do. What we're going to start with. Oh, one more question I forgot to ask. How many of the React developers are using React hooks versus class-based components? Okay, cool. So this will be, for the rest of it will kind of be an introduction. I wanted to start with a class-based component, and then we refactor into hooks, and then into MobX, but that would take 2 hours. So we'll kind of go along. First thing I want to go over is why I think React hooks are kind of a great leap for React as a UI library, right? Most people say one of the biggest strengths of React hooks is that less boilerplate. You don't have to use classes anymore. You can create a functional component which can maintain state, and that is true. That's a good strength. There's much less boilerplate, and it feels more functional. But there's actually another advantage that I like, and it encourages you to split your state out of the component so it's easier to test. And I'm going to show you this. So why that's important is I really try to use test-driven development, or promote it as much as I can. Who's familiar with test-driven development? Almost a lot of people, great. For those who don't know, test-driven development is you write the test first, and it fails, and then you write the code to satisfy that test. And then you kind of go back and forth, you write the test, you write more code. You write the test, you write more code, and in the end, based on my personal experience, the quality of the code was much better than first writing the code and then testing it, because that typically leads to refactoring, because it's something about how you write tests. They're very human readable, especially when you have the format as described, and it, etc., etc. So, traditionally, with class-based components, TDD is kind of tedious, because you write a test, and then you have to create this component that manages state internally that has a bunch of DOM elements to satisfy your test case. So most people, when they do that, they write the test, and then they go and actually create some DOM elements, just enough, and then they test whether the snapshot matches or not, which is totally fine. But if you have a component with a complex state with lots of permutations, you're left with a lot of snapshots, and it feels much cleaner for me personally to test the state part of it separately and to leave the elements and the components as dumb as possible, so that you can test every permutation just like you do with a Node.js program, for example. You have some sort of input, and you test the output. And you can test the output in one line. You don't need snapshots, you don't need anything like that. And then once you are confident that you've tested your state, you bring it in as a hook into a higher level component, and then you test the individual pieces that are involved using snapshots by just giving them some props. Now you don't have to test what every component is going to be like in the tree based on 5 or 10 or 100 different permutations of your state. So to me, that's actually the biggest advantage, is that you can test state separately. So let's get started. This is the other stuff that I kind of mocked up before, is I mocked up the response that I get from the API server. This is a library called just mock fetch that mocks fetch requests. And for now, I'm mocking one page of movies and a second page of movies, because that's something I wanted to show. So I've also mocked out what this component should do on a state level. And obviously, if we look at it here, it should be able to fetch movies and populate the top area. A little fetch button. You should be able to add things to the queue, and you should be able to like and dislike things. So we know ahead of time, what's the functionality. So we can go ahead and get started. So for those new to hooks or those who've used hooks, there is a library called Testing Library React Hooks that lets you test them in isolation without having to have them inside of components. I found it very useful. It has a couple caveats that we'll kind of see as we go, but for the most part it works great. All right, let's get started. So the first test is actually rendering, or let's make sure that the hook returns the API that we expect. That's usually what I do. So there's this result object, and we'll call the hook use movies. Okay. The result object has a current property. This is something from render hook, and that's going to return the current state. So first thing we'll do is just to make sure it works, we'll say result.current.movies to equal an empty array. Okay, let me make sure this is running. Bigger. Okay, so the test failed because there is no file called movies, right? it's usually how TDD starts. So we'll create a file called movies.js. In there, we'll export a function called choose movies. And if I'm ever stuck, please help me. This is how these live coding things go. You can never expect what's coming. And that slide you saw was one of 2 slides I prepared. So, okay. So as you see, the test passed. Actually, I'm going to comment out the other test, just not to have these full positive. Got myself in the back too soon, too early. So we have a hook, and that exposes an empty movies object. Fine. So now we're also going to have a queue, because that's going to represent the data at the bottom. We'll come back and fix the test, and we're going to have like, dislike, and add to queue functions. So we're going to do. This is going to be like, dislike, add to queue, and then we're going to take this, and we're going to do check off. Maybe there's a better way to do this, but that's what we're getting for now. And then queue, like, and there's one more, actually we'll call it fetch all, and this is the one that's going to fetch the list. So that's that. This file. Okay, fetch all to be a function. The test pass. Okay, so we already know kind of what the API is going to look like of this one. Great. Now let's actually fetch some data. So we're going to render the hook again, and we have to perform an asynchronous action, obviously, because we have to make a server call using fetch. So there's going to be some async awaits in the picture, just to make it nice and clean. But there's one thing that you have to do. Anytime you perform an action on a hook, like hold a function that changes its internal state, you have to wrap it in an act. And React provides an act function from their side for testing, which is wrapped in this testing library. But essentially, what it does is it ensures that all the state is resolved by the time, it gets committed by the time you actually have to inspect the value. So rule of thumb, anytime you call methods or anything like that, wrap them in an act. So it can be something like this, and then result current.fetch all. Now, this is an asynchronous function, so we'll await that, and then we'll have to pass async. And then because the contents of act are asynchronous, we also have to await act. Otherwise, it's not going to resolve in time. And then we're going to expect that result.current.movies is going to be our mock movies. So the request comes back in this form. There's obviously more data, but whatever parts we need to care about are in here because they have an IMDb ID and there's a search. So since we only care about that, we're going to just do search. Okay, mock movies. Actually, we don't need to do that because that's it. Now the test fails, and it says it fails because it's expecting to get all these movies, but it got an empty array. Cool, let's make it get all those movies. So, what we're going to do is we're going to create an async function called fetch all. Okay, and then we're going to await. We're going to hit this URL. I'm going to put it in these ahead of time, just to make life easier. And this is going to give us a response. Then we're going to say new movies equals await res.json to get the JSON data. There's not going to be error handling. That's not out of scope for this. And then we actually need to populate movies somehow. And this is starting to become stateful, right? So in React hooks, what you need to do is the equivalent of a state is you have this use state hook, which exposes the name, I guess, or the variable that holds the actual state, followed by the setter function to the state. So in this case, you're going to go movies, set movies, and we're going to say use state empty array, and we're going to import use state. VS Code is trying to be too smart from React. Okay, and we're going to make sure before I forget, because I'm going to, that we're actually passing movies right through. And in here, what we're going to do is we're going to set movies to the new movies we get dot search, because we just need that part. We don't really need anything else. And then we make sure that fetch all is also exposed. Okay, so the test passed, which means that we're now making a successful request to the API and getting data back. Cool, let's move on to the next thing. So, as I mentioned before, we wanted to be able to go through multiple pages, and the API returns, I think, 10 items at a time. So let's do that. We're going to copy the same things we did last time, but we're going to call fetch all twice, and then when that comes back, we expect the result to be, I guess we'll have the new page first and then the old page, right? Because we want to see the new stuff first. So we have this mock movies page 2. We're going to have that search and movies, yeah. So this should have, let's see, our test fails, and our test fails because it doesn't have page 2 in it, right? So let's make that work. So we have page that we pass into the API endpoint. What we need to do is actually pass a variable. And this is another concept of React hooks, is anytime in class-based components, you have to store an instance variable. On this, in React hooks, you use a useRef. At least that's my rule of thumb. We'll see later on when it comes to functions, but so far it hasn't failed me, so that's the way I do it. So we're going to store page as a variable. We're going to start with 1, because I don't think it starts with 0 for that particular endpoint. And anytime you want to, so use ref, the reason you want to use it for instance variables is because it maintains its current value throughout the life cycle of this component. So from the time it's mounted to the time it's unmounted. So anytime it re-renders, the value holds the same. So that's why you would use ref in this case. So, and if you want to access the value, you would do page.current. So that's the current value of that instance variable. So let's take a look. The test still failed, right? Because we haven't incremented it. So we need to do page current plus. Okay. Now it's going to it's showing stuff from the second page, but not the first, right? Because we haven't actually appended movies together. So what we need to do is we're going to take what's currently inside of the movies state object, and this wasn't very well documented. Just like set state isn't really that documented that you can have that the first parameter is the current state. But when I found out, it made things so much easier. I'll kind of go into that a little later. So what we need to do is we're going to return a new state. Actually, I don't even think we need that. That has new movies.search followed by the movies that are there right now. Okay, test pass. So now no matter how many times you do fetch, it should fetch the next page. I don't have any mock data for page 3, so we're not going to worry about that. We're going to trust that it works. Okay, adding movies into the queue. So when I was kind of thinking about the architecture of this, one way to solve this problem is have queue as its own state. And then just, when you have a movie you add to the queue, just push it onto the queue. And the problem with that is things can get out of sync. So, for example, if you have some movies in your queue on Netflix and Netflix doesn't have the movie anymore, you have stale data in your queue, right? So typically you either, you can write code to keep them in sync, but in my opinion, the queue should be representative, should be like a snapshot of what's in your movies, but that's been flagged as the queue. So let's kind of see how we can implement that. So first, we have to fetch the movies. Then we're going to call, I'm just going to use this function, I'm going to use this. So I think this is the first time we're calling something that's not asynchronous. And we're going to do add to queue, and we're going to pass it one of the movies that's currently in the state object, right? So we don't have to mess with some data being out of sync or anything like that. So we can do result.current movies, and let's say the fourth one. And then we're going to make sure that our queue has one movie in it, which is the movie we pushed in, right? So we save it, the test fails because it's expecting us to have this IMDb4 movie. Let's satisfy the test. So we're going to do function add to queue movie. For those who haven't used React, we're going to write a lot of code to do such simple things, but it is what it is. So what we need to do, because the philosophy of React without using any frameworks, and kind of Redux as well, is you never mutate state directly. You always return new state. And which means that I can't just modify a movie. I have to create a copy of the movie's array, create a copy of movie, and splice, replace the item in the array with a certain flag. So in this case, the flag is going to be in queue. So let's do that. So we're going to take movies. So I'm going to say movies copy equals movies, and then we're going to find the index, movies index of movie, and we're going to splice in place. Wow. Sometimes, this is why I don't worry about AI just yet. Because if they haven't figured out how to do that, I'm being totally kidding. Okay, so we're going to splice this at index, which is where that movie is currently. We want one item, and we want to replace it with what's a copy of the movie, and we'll just add in queue as a variable and say true. And then we're going to return the copy of the array. And this is how you update arrays in state in React. You do the same thing, outside too. There's tools to help. Like there's an update function in React tools, but we're going low level. So, okay. So we're going to expose add to queue. So the test still fails, and the test fails because it's looking for queue to have that item, and it doesn't. All we did was set movies has not. So what we need to do is kind of make make queue a snapshot, right? Or maybe there's better words for it. So we're going to filter movies on this, and we're going to return movies that are in queue. Cool. Okay. So far, so good. Next, we'll do liking a movie. So we can basically copy a lot of this. And we're going to change this to like. The API for like would be the same, just pass in the movie. And then instead of the queue, we're going to say, what's the best way? Let's map them actually. So we're going to go through all the movies, and we're going to map through them and retrieve their, let's call it score in here. And then in the result, since we have how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll do 4, 5. And then the fourth one, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay, the last one should have a score of 1 because that's the like. Okay, let's find out. Now I'm going to edit the data slightly just to add some scores, just to save some boilerplate. Yeah, so the test fails because it's getting a 0, but we're expecting a 1. Good, because we haven't put together the function yet. So I'm going to copy this because it's going to be very, very similar because we're again just editing one item. And we're going to like this movie. Instead of in queue, we're going to take the score of it and say movie.score plus 1. I think that should do it. And then we expose like fast. And we can do the same for dislike. Now, in optimization, obviously, the two functions are so similar, but just for the sake of the demo, we'll keep it the way it is now. And then obviously, you probably don't want things to go below 1, but again, purposes of the demo. And we're going to call this dislike. The test fails because it's getting a 0. So we're just going to copy this function, paste it in, and subtract 1. And that didn't work because we didn't expose it. Okay, so that's it. The test part is done. Now we have this React hook that we can insert into basically any component and wire it up to actual DOM elements. We're confident that it works. We're not using snapshots, so we're not digging through DOM elements just to figure out what state it's in. So let's go ahead and wire it up. So we're going to take app, make sure it's actually running somewhere. Oh, any questions so far?
I go pretty fast, sorry.
I didn't know how long it was going to take, so I'm like,
Can you explain how it was able to add the flag on the movie state?
the movie state
Yeah.
inside which flag? Like
In the function like, you
Mhm.
add the flags, like you added a score, and in the add to queue you added in queue on top of movies, right?
Yes.
So it doesn't need to like that index was not there, right?
So the index was there. Basically, if you want to update a single item in an array in the app, is you copy the array, and then you find where that item is, and then you replace it with splice with a copy of the item plus whatever attributes you need. And that's, from what I've seen, that's generally the pattern. There's easier ways though, but that's generally the pattern. Any more? All right, so let's fire it up. To the fun part. Okay, so we're going to import use movies from movies. So I'm going to just create a bunch of components. So we'll look at the one that works now. We're going to have a movies component. We're going to have a queue component. Within the movies component and the queue, we're going to have a movie component that they reference, and then we'll have a rating component to actually do the stars. That's kind of the structure I'm thinking. So movies. Oh, missing a matching different styles. Okay, so we're going to return just a div. We're going to pass in a movies array, and then we're going to map through the movies, and then return a movie component, which could use better wording, but takes in a movie. We'll use the key of IMDb ID. Okay. Perfect. So now let's build the actual movie component, which again could be a better word, but it returns div. I looked at the API and we have a few fields. I'm gonna just put them in, but obviously, using TypeScript or something that we can actually infer the interface early on in the test and all that, but that takes a lot longer to demonstrate. So what we'll do is we'll do movie.title and then movie.poster is going to be an image. Okay, that should be good. Like I mentioned earlier, I added a few classes. So this one we'll call movies. And the other one that's very similar, but the reason I want to keep it separate is when we start profiling, it's just easier to see the two different components. So just bear with me there. Movies, and we're going to pass in the movies right here. And then view takes movies as well. Now we're going to actually use the hook. So we're going to say fetch all, because we're going to have a button that does it. And then we're going to have a movies array. Use movies. So this is how you use a hook that we just built. I'm going to add a button. And I'm going to say fetch. Fetch all. Okay. Nice. Stuff is rendering. My classes aren't set up because they're not in here. Okay, let me get some CSS classes. Okay, much better. But obviously Q shouldn't have the movies in it. So we're gonna go into app and make sure we're passing in Q inside of the Q. At the moment it should be empty. So that's one part of it. Now we need to add our add to Q like and dislike buttons. So let's do that. I'm going to say add to queue. So we'll say add to queue and pass in the movie. Like that. Like and dislike. And then we need these three functions passed in. Cool. And we also need them passed into here from the top component. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, we're adding things to the queue. Like and dislike does nothing. So let's implement that. So we'll add a ratings component at the bottom that takes in a score, and we pass in a score for the movie. The rating component, ratings component takes a score, and it returns a div. Let's see, Unicode star. Let's find some stars. That's kind of cool looking, right? Okay, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And splice that from 0 to how many stars there are. Toss it in the thing. And then we say, okay, so that should do it. Let's see. We did not. Okay. No, actually it did not, because the data we get from the server doesn't have scores in it, and we're trying to add 1 to something that doesn't have a score in it. Let's see what data we get back. Yeah, there's no score, because score is something we're keeping track of internally in the application. So I'm surprised there wasn't an error, which is kind of scary. I'm not sure if React hooks are hiding them, but you would definitely suspect, because if I log, oh, no, sorry, not now. We log movies and we hit like. That's the third one. So yeah, we got not a number. I guess JavaScript's like, oh, it's not a number. Don't need to throw an error. Everything's cool. That's why I use TypeScript. Yeah. Wow. All right. So let's fix that, and we need to fix that actually in our API call when we fetch the movies from search. We need to map, and we're going to return. Brackets, we're going to return and just set the score to 0. That should do it. No. There it is. Okay. Let's see. Hey, there we go. We got some stars. Yes?
So presumably in a real app, you would sort of keep that state somewhere. How does that state work then with React?
Sorry, the state?
The state of the stars for the user.
Oh, well, it's already in there. It's inside of movies, right?
Now it is.
Now it is. So are you saying like offline? Oh, persist. So that's when you add a persistence layer, and likely, when the application starts up, you merge it from your persistence layer to what you're getting, from the server or something along those lines. Yeah. Which is a good topic for a talk for sure. So, and
is the persistence like stored locally or remote, or it depends on how?
It depends on the application. If you want a progressive web app, then you can use local storage for something like this because it's fairly simple. You just hash the IDs. And, at Mapton, we use IndexedDB heavily because we have, I don't know if you've seen those kiosks at the malls. Those are our kiosks, so they need to work offline all the time. So we store, and IndexedDB is very versatile because you can store blobs, so that you can store images and other binary type, data in there. But when it comes to selecting a persistence layer, neither MobX nor React kind of dictate, or even React hooks what you choose. You kind of have to find out for yourself. Okay. So, cool, this app actually works, but if we want to build something that's going to perform well, we need to optimize it, right? Yes.
What happens if we click add to queue in one of the queue?
In the queue, it gets an error. And that's because we haven't passed in the functions to queue, right? Because ideally, you wouldn't want those buttons down there anyway. So the best way to do that is you can just say, okay, if add to queue is not available, or if it is available, only then do you render all those buttons, and otherwise you don't. So now you can't do that. But the stars still show up, right? And this is the advantage of having the data, having the queue a snapshot of your movies, right? Is the data is in sync. Okay, let's move on to optimizations. So if you look at how Netflix is built on some of the other apps, they actually had to do so much optimizations because they had to run on PlayStation 4 and a bunch of other low-power devices. So one of the key things you want to ensure is nothing should render unless data changed which forced it to render, right? React out of the box right now will re-render everything. So if I hit like, it's going to re-render the queue. Mind you, it kind of has to because the stars are in there. But if I fetch more movies, it's going to re-render everything in the queue. In fact, if we like one of the movies, it's going to re-render all of the movies, right? That's how React works out of box. And I'll show you how you can take a look at that. Whole app, every single component, subcomponent, everything re-rendered, right? So if you click on stuff, you can actually see why it re-rendered, right? And you know, there was one actually legitimate re-render. I think it was this one. No, which movie did we do? The second one. So it's this one. Yeah. So this one re-rendered because the movie actually changed. But then the other ones re-render because add to queue, like and dislike changed. And we'll get to that in a second, but also the queue changed even though the movie is not in the queue. And the movie in the queue re-rendered, and the ratings component in it re-rendered, even though none of that changed. So the first thing you can do to optimize for all of that is put all of your components inside a React memo, right? React memo memoizes the component and then does a shallow check on the props. And if the props are the same, it simply doesn't re-render the component. So we're going to do that first. So let's do this. Let's try this, and why not? Okay. Mess that up a little bit. No, that's not it. Okay. Sorry, my keyboard is. I have the Apple greet them saying that their keyboards suck. So it's a bit of a struggle sometimes. Memo. And then do these by hand. Save it. Seems like everything is fine. Okay, I'm gonna leave this tab open and like keep the tabs open as we kind of progress, just so we have a good baseline for comparison. I'm gonna open the profiler. I'm gonna fetch the movies. I'm gonna add one to the queue because we want to see the whole. You want as many components populated and rendered so that you can actually see what's re-rendered, right? And then we're going to start profiling. We'll take a movie that's not in the queue, hit like, stop profiling. Okay, it's looking better. It's looking better because at least some things are not being re-rendered. So the ratings for each movie is gray, and it tells you did not render during the session. That's perfect. The queue re-rendered, but the movie in the queue didn't, and neither did its ratings. So already there is some improvement. And this is kind of a gotcha that I realized a while back, but if you look at why these other movies re-rendered, is because the functions that we're passing in changed, which was so foreign to me, because when you write class-based components, you know, you pass in references to those functions, and it's fine, right? So I was like, it's got to be hooks. There's got to be something to do with hooks. Sure enough, it was. And what was happening was the way the React hook re-renders top to bottom every time you set state, which means that every time it re-renders, it creates a new instance of add to queue, a new instance of like, a new instance of dislike. So it's a totally new reference, which is why the component thinks that you're passing in something new, and the components re-render. And the cheapest, easiest way to solve this problem is by the rule of thumb I mentioned initially, where if you need a local variable, whether it's a function or if it's a variable, just use ref. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna create local versions of the function, and then we're going to cache them.
But could you use callback here?
You could.
Functions.
So I find that if all your function does is it calls set state on something, then you don't benefit from use callback, because use ref, it just handles it for you.
Because you don't use dependency. Right.
Exactly, because the set state already has the movies object in it, so you don't really need to use callback. And I found that use ref, for me personally, it's easier to reason about, because this way all local instances are, you know, whatever I used to use on this in class-based components now is use ref, right? So I like the consistency in that regard. So we do like, dislike, okay, and then make sure that we're passing in like the current, dislike the current. Now, a lot of people who haven't used hooks are kind of disliking hooks right now, and this is a little bit backwards. I totally agree, which goes great into my next part of the talk. Okay, we don't care about fetch all because we're not passing it as a prop anywhere. I think that should do it. So I'm going to leave this open again. I'm going to open another instance. Fetch the movies, profiler, add something to queue, start profiling, we'll like this movie. Cool, okay, so now only the movie that changed in the movies queue actually re-renders, and its ratings, because it had a star that changed. The top level component, which is the app, and the movies component re-rendered because, if you look at it, hooks changed. So because this use movies hook is at the top level, whenever it changes, it's going to propagate down, right? Typically, React is good at memoizing. React is better at memoizing items and lists because they have an ID. They have keys. We can go further optimizing, but I wanted to kind of jump to the next part, and that's how we can introduce MobX into this and kind of refactor it and see its benefits. Before I do that, any questions?
Is the state kept in the memoizer sort of at risk when you sort of use your actions?
Just the functions, you mean?
I suppose, and the return function from the...
Not really, because it's just storing the reference to it, and then it gets cleaned up if the component that asked for the hook gets unmounted, then all of that is out of the memory, right? So it's only there for the duration of the life cycle from mount to unmount, and then it's done.
It's kind of well managed, and you don't have to worry about it.
No, you don't have to, yeah.
Why this functionality of memo by default in it? Like, why it's such a thing?
Why isn't it default?
Yeah, like it saves a lot of memory.
Because, let's say, that's a good question. I've always wondered that too. Maybe they kind of left it open so that people can have their own implementations of memo, and I'll show you how MobX does it. It's very similar. or maybe they didn't want to imply, because by default memo does a shallow compare, but you can actually pass in your own function and do a deep comparison if you want, right? So maybe for them it was easier, but I think the biggest reason is they added it later on. So maybe it was just to keep things more consistent.
I don't think it's that about answering that. I think so React was sort of originally designed to re-render everything every time, and that's supposed to be fast enough that it just doesn't matter. So if you use memo every time, then you have to use immutable data in your props, which Anzor did. Like that's why we made a complete copy of the movies list and then just changed the things we wanted to change. If the data wasn't immutable, and like good luck teaching someone who is like picking this up like for their first day, they're like, oh, I have to make everything
That's
immutable.
a good point. Because if you would have mutated the movies already in place, then the memo wouldn't re-render the component because it wouldn't know that the movies changed, right? Because the reference would remain the same. So things right.
Yeah.
That's why. So for anyone who just picks up React, it just re-renders everything, and then you kind of optimize as you go along. Okay. Let's move to the fun part. We're going to take our React hook and refactor it from MobX. So I'm just going to copy the file and paste it. We're not going to do the tests first for MobX, just to save some time. But then we'll come back to the test and refactor them after. So because that's going to just take a minute. Okay. Movies MobX. So we're going to export a factory function. We call it movie store. And inside we're going to build a store, which is going to be an observable. And observable is something you get from the MobX library. We're also MobX, and then we're going to return the store. And let's copy some stuff over. So we're going to have movies. We're going to have queue. I'm going to copy paste some of these methods, and then we'll refactor them as we go along. One thing I should note, so one of the biggest differences with MobX is that their philosophy is the opposite. They want you to mutate state in place as much as possible. That's actually one of the strengths of MobX, is you mutate state in place, and it figures out what it should render and what it shouldn't render, and performs optimizations on that one. And we're going to kind of see them. So first example of that is our fetch all function. So we're actually going to, right now we're returning a new copy. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to take the movies in the store and unshift them to insert new movies in at the start. It's a lot of times. Okay. So we're modifying the array in place by inserting those items in. There's no more use ref, so we don't need to do page depth current. In fact, you can use, because this is a factory, it's going to give you local scope. So if you need any local variables, you just store them on top before you return the actual function. Then we have, there's something you have to do anytime you're mutating state, is you have to wrap your function in an action in MobX. And what that does, it's A, to kind of enforce some of their debugging tooling so that you know which actions you're taking, but also it keeps all of your state mutations in one transaction, so that if you have one component that's listening to movies and queue, and you're editing both movies and queue in one action, it's not going to render twice. It's going to wait for the whole action to go through, and then as one transaction, apply mutations, and render the component once. So you can actually use it without actions. It's an opt-in, but I recommend actually wrapping things in actions. So that should be good for fetch all. We'll take add, let's take add to queue. This is where the fun part starts. And we're actually going to take all three. Just like that. And just have to wrap them in action.
Sorry, what does wrapping it in action do again?
So it helps with the debugging tools in MobX. It kind of like Redux tells you what actions you're committing, but also all your state mutations are done in one transaction.
Okay.
Meaning that it doesn't do unnecessary renders if like two of your things would affect the same component. So it batches updates to React in a set of transactions. One more thing. Okay, perfect. Now let's get rid of this. I don't think we need that anymore. We don't need any React stuff anymore. So
you wouldn't use action in production?
you would, because you do want the batches and you want that performance in production. But it does have a benefit in development because you can use developer tools. So we're going to move this out and go movie in queue equals true. And let's say movie score plus plus and movie score minus minus. So in place.
So we don't want to write more code.
Yeah, I mean, who wants to write more code, right? One thing, so before we had that queue that was kind of a snapshot. In MobX, anything you set as a getter automatically gets memoized for you and only returns, I guess, reruns when any of the observables that it listens to change, right? So I'll show you an example. So all you have to do is set get queue, which is the standard ES5 getter, and then you return store.movies.map, .filter, and .inqueue. So this way, only when movies change does it recompute this function. Otherwise, you're getting a memoized version at all times. I think this is ready to get wired up. So let's go in here. We'll import it. Store from movies. And so MobX works without React. In fact, I've used it in the backend applications as well. The React portion is kind of secondary, and that comes in a library called MobX React. And in order to actually have your components observe things in your MobX store, you need this observer function. And it works very much like Memo. In fact, it's actually a wrapper around Memo with a couple MobX specific things where it observes. So we'll do MobX React, and we'll just take all the memos with observer. We don't need that anymore. And it also comes with a function called use local store. And that's actually a way to wrap your factory function of your store within a React hook so that it's available to use. So use local store. All we have to do is do this and pass in our movie store. That didn't work on the first try. Okay, quick look. Movie store is not exported from movies. Ah. The inspector. Okay. So it works. It's great. So that was showing how quickly you can refactor something that you wrote with hooks into MobX, shave some code, which we all like. I'm going to show you a couple cool things that you get for free when you do it like this. So we'll run the profiler. We'll do the same exact test we did last time. So I'm going to like this movie. I'm going to stop. So the only thing that we rendered is the movie and its ratings. Everything else remained the same. And it did that automatically. I'm going to show you one more thing. So, let's say we have, let's say we don't care about showing stars in the queue, right? So, because it's shown somewhere else, or it could be any other piece of data. But basically what we're going to say is, and I should have shown this in the non-MobX version for a bigger aha moment, but you can kind of take me for it. What we're going to do is, when things are in a queue, we're actually going to get rid of these stars. Or actually, first I'll show you what happens when we do like something in the queue, right? So obviously, you have the movie in the list that we rendered and its ratings, and in the movie in the queue and its ratings, right? That's what you'd expect, because those are the things that change. Now, if we didn't care about the ratings in the queue, the non-MobX version, there'd be no way to not have the queue movie re-rendered if we had changed the ratings on it, because it was a snapshot of it, and there's no optimizations done for you. In MobX, you get that stuff for free, and I'll show you what I mean. So in the queue, we have, let's just say that if there's no like button, there is no rating, just to keep it simple. Okay, so now we'll fetch, now to queue, there's no more rating. And take a snapshot, we're going to like the same movie that's in the queue, which means it's making a change to that object. Stop. The queue doesn't re-render, neither does the movie. So the way this works is MobX keeps track of every observable that you reference in your components, and if those observables are no longer referenced, it doesn't re-render it, and it does that for you.
I mean, you could do that in the React version, but you would just have to destructure movie down into 3 separate crops, one for title, one for poster, and one for score, and then pass them individually. So in that way, if title and poster could update, but if score didn't change, then
Right. If you didn't want to pass,
you wouldn't pass the score down to the last one.
Right. No,
so it would be tons of work. I'm trying to reinforce your point here.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
It's perfect. And then one more thing before we jump back and refactor the test. This is just going to take a couple minutes. Another reason why MobX is why this kind of architecture is nice is because you can prevent dog drilling, right? So we can quickly. What we're going to do is we're going to, from our MobX store, we're going to export default React create content and just keep it empty. Okay, and then we're going to import it in here. This is kind of the pattern that we follow. Context. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a provider and we set the value to the store. We'll do that in a second. And then okay, we're not going to pass anything anymore. So we'll just do that. These. And now in our components, since we use the context provider, we can use the use context hook to get access to that version of the store at the time, to that instance of it. So we can do movies equals use context. And then what would we call it? Movie store window. And then we don't have to pass it in anymore. Just make sure it's defined. Okay, we'll add a couple more things in. And then obviously this one. Also, we don't need to pass function anymore. I mean, when you're looking for a movie array, instantiating a movie with that data makes sense. But functions really, I prefer just using context for that. So in that case, all we need is this, and movies anymore. That should do it. Let's make sure everything still works. Oh, it didn't. And it's because we're using movies instead of Q. Yeah, everything still works. So that's how you would basically create. Usually when we create our component tree, each state will be living next to the parent component, and then it will trickle down to the children as they need it. And then when we test the children, you can, in your unit test, you can just basically mock your provider and test that they're actually behaving the way that they should, right? That they're calling, for example, clicking on that button should trigger like, and so you mock up the context provider of your store, and you as a jest function, and then you make sure that when you click the button in your test, that the spy gets called, right? So just a little bit about how to do that. So I wanted to do one thing, and then we can do the questions. Let's go ahead and make the tests work in MobX. Show them how to do this. MobX test. Okay, I'm gonna rerun it here. We're gonna import movies store. Okay, we're going to take the line where every line that we render the hook and just do const store equals movie store. That's a function. We're going to take everywhere we do result.current, change it to store. And we don't need, we do need a wait for the fetch all, but we don't need to act anymore because we're not anywhere near the React ecosystem. So we can take that out. I think I did that. Okay, and anywhere we call a function, we do that. Okay, well that's yeah, that was basically it. Any questions? Yes. Oh.
So I'm a little bit puzzled about the approach MobX takes, because in the last few years I've seen like a general trend in programming languages of immutability. Yeah, I mean to protect programmers against themselves. Yeah.
Right.
So what MobX is taking the opposite direction with making the state mutable.
Right.
So do you think is any danger here of having side effects or something that affects the robustness of the application?
So I think it does a lot of magic under the hood, right? I usually, when I compare it to Redux, which is immutable, Redux does very little under the hood. It's a small library, but it makes you pay for it at work. Whereas MobX, it's a larger library because it kind of tries to guard you against those things. So from what I've seen, if you follow kind of the general practices of keeping your transactions inside of an action, definitely there's a learning curve. But from my personal experience, because I think it's about picking the right tool for the job. Personally, at Mapton, we have all of our consumer-facing products use MobX. And then our enterprise, like our CMS, uses Redux. And the CMS, it has undo and redo state, and there's like a million actions and things like that. So you get kind of some of that for free out of the box because of immutability. Whereas all of the other consumer-facing applications, I've always thought Redux is kind of an overkill and worrying about immutability because you're dispatching data from the server and making manipulations, maybe caching it, and then displaying it to the user in the most efficient way possible. Usually because our kiosks, they have to run on very low power hardware, and that's why it's important to make sure that we're not taking CPU and GPU cycles to re-render stuff. Yeah, but in terms of the trend, I have seen the trend. In fact, I've been following, I don't know if who remembers, but there was an actual ES6 or ES7 observer spec in the works for ECMA 6, which would allow you to observe things for changes in a very similar way. And it got kind of tossed away because proxies came around. And if you've seen how proxies work, is they let you wrap an object and you wrap access to it, and then you can basically create a pub/sub notification system with that. And if you look at the MobX observable, each one is just a proxy. So it looks like a real object, it looks like a real array, but it's wrapped. So I feel like, even though there is a trend with proxies, that's opened up more doors to make immutable states more, I guess, safe.
But with MobX, I noticed there is kind of a transactional nature of the way in which the state is set. Mm-hmm. So is that protecting you kind of the side effects? What happens if you have, I'm ignorant, can you have a scenario when you have multiple kind of these transactions that can mess up your states,
So, synchronous operations are synchronous in JavaScript, right? So they're going to happen in order, and your tree is going to change, your state tree in order. If you have a lot of asynchronous operations, they're going to modify the state whenever they're completed, right? It's up to you as a developer to ensure that the order in which asynchronous functions come in kind of happens in the order that you expect, right? But I'm not sure if that's any different in Redux. Like, I feel like you still have to with either Sagas or what's the latest way to do this? James is like
Not coming anymore.
all right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, there was one more question? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. We have a 5-minute break. Please take still some donuts. If you want to have water, we have cups here. There's water in the kitchen.